Hi, everybody. I'm Jasmine Dadlani, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of McKinney.
My name is Jenny Nicholson. I'm the Executive Director of Brand Experience at McKinney.
And welcome to our talk, Things Left Unsaid, Bridging the Parental Divide at Work. So last year, we were all struck by all of the attention working parents were garnering over what my dear colleague Jenny accurately calls being in the shit. And we were in the shit. There is no argument that that attention is well-deserved. We all know that there is so little governmental or societal structure in place to help working parents in the US. And that is an undeniable truth and a very worthy topic for another time. But what we started wondering about was the other side. If you were someone without children, having to watch people's kids interrupt Zoom meetings regularly, or having to step in for a colleague who was trying to homeschool, of course you would be empathetic, right? But wouldn't that start to kind of get old at some point? You know, you might get a little resentment, and eventually you might even start to feel somewhat burdened, right, by the parents on your team. And this resentment probably also existed in the before times, with parents having to leave work early to make a school play or talking about their kids all the time. So we wanted to dive into that and see how non-parents were feeling about parents. What's interesting is that we started to look on the internet, and turns out there's not a lot of data that exists in the industry about people with children versus people without children. So we decided to survey them. We talked with over 500 parents and non-parents in advertising agencies and in marketing and clients, and we conducted several one-on-one interviews. And we figured that there would be this unspoken divide between working parents and non-parents, and that non-parents would at least be somewhat irked by all the attention given to parents, especially recently.
At least that's what we as two working moms thought we were going to find out. What we actually discovered was the complete opposite. It turns out that parents are the ones who are not particularly kind or gracious to non-parents. In fact, parents, we project a whole lot of negativity onto non-parents and expect that they feel the same way in return, when in actuality, they don't at all. So really for us, what was interesting is launching this survey. We thought we would learn some interesting things about the industry, but it really became an exercise for us in facing some of our own bias. You know, even the language that we used for the survey, we found was starting to center parents a little bit. I mean, the term itself, non-parents, that's not a great term because it's defining somebody by the absence of something. You know, that's like calling myself a non-man. I would not love that. Childless, same thing. Child-free, there's so much like cultural angst around some of these words that finding a term that didn't feel like it was excluding somebody became really difficult. We never did find a great replacement, but we're still excited to share what we learned from the survey. You know, and before we get into the details of the survey, you know, we want to point out that parents and people who aren't parents are not homogeneous groups, right? Every parental experience is different. Every person who doesn't have a child is different. And there are also all kinds of intersections at play, you know, gender, race, seniority, marital status. All of those things are really important. One of the things we discovered is this is a way bigger topic than we expected. We feel like we're just scratching the surface. And so for the purposes of this presentation, we're keeping things high level, and we're going to show you some of the most interesting numbers as it relates to that sort of breakdown between parents and non-parents. But please know that we're going to keep digging into this conversation and sharing some of the stuff that we've learned. Let's start with the first assumption we had going into this talk, that there is this divide between parents and non-parents who work in advertising and marketing. And it turns out there's some truth to this one. 2/3 of us think there's at least a moderate us versus them dynamic between parents and non-parents, with parents actually thinking that even a little bit more.
So it turns out we were right about one thing at least. But let's look at what's causing that divide. First, overall work-life balance. It's no surprise that parents think they struggle with this issue more. 75% of parents believe parents have a harder time with work-life balance. But among those without children, slightly over half believe parents have a harder time, while 4 in 10, so almost 40%, think it's equal for both. So right there, we start to see some disconnects. Then, when you look at how each side thinks about being a parent or not a parent has affected them career-wise, parents are the ones who actually feel like they've taken a much bigger hit. For example, 2/3 of parents have experienced negative emotions as a result of expectations on them related to their parental status. This is twice as much as non-parents told us. And half of parents feel like they've been held back in their career or missed out on assignments and projects they wanted due to being a parent. Now, whether this is perception or reality, if you carry these thoughts, of course, it's going to come with some negativity around it. For non-parents, similar feelings were really only in the teens. There is one interesting area of commonality, though, which is that an equal amount of parents and non-parents feel that the people that they work with make unfair assumptions about their work versus personal time due to their parental status. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but that was an interesting place where the two sides actually agreed.
The second area we asked about were the perceived benefits and challenges of working with the other side. And here's where parents really start to come out looking not so hot. So parents see non-parents as having more time, more flexibility. They really like all of that, right? That they're available to work more, they're flexible, they can travel. You see here in that dark red that they're all about that. But then when you look at the challenges, they actually seem to question non-parents' empathy, their ability to handle difficult situations, how they deal with personal challenges. So basically, parents are like, we want to give you more work and we're really glad you can take it, but we're also going to kind of sit back and question whether or not you have the maturity or ability to pull it off. For their part, non-parents see a lot of benefits about working with parents, mainly in the area of EQ, things like their empathy for others, their ability to handle difficult situations, their ability to multitask. But then on the other side, when it comes to challenges, not surprisingly, non-parents say the biggest struggle is the level of distraction that a parent often brings, their level of flexibility, not being able to work the same kind of hours. And then also, it's a challenge to work with parents because their ability to travel is limited. The third area is where things get really interesting, and that's when we start looking at the negative emotions each side feels towards each other and what they think the other group feels about them. So in keeping with our pattern, you will see that parents are not at all gracious toward non-parents. They are significantly less likely to feel respect, admiration, and empathy toward non-parents. Well, if you look and you'll see that non-parents actually feel those in a pretty high degree toward parents. And while not a majority of people feel this way, you see that parents are much more likely to have felt jealousy, resentment, anger, and disappointment toward non-parents than non-parents feel toward them.
Gets worse, sorry to say. Parents think that non-parents actually feel much more negatively towards them than they in reality do. So these charts illustrate a fascinating disconnect. Parents are missing all of these positive emotions that people without children have towards them. So if you think of the line on this chart has this reality baseline, okay? Everything above the line is how non-parents actually feel. So they feel empathy, they feel sympathy, they feel appreciation for parents. So this is a real blind spot that parents have, because what's below the line is what parents think that non-parents feel about them, even though they don't. So parents are projecting a whole lot. Parents, none of this is meant to make you feel bad. What we hope is that this data becomes an eye-opener. We need to recognize and reciprocate this gift of empathy that our colleagues without children are giving to us. Now, that said, non-parents have the same disconnect. They are missing the respect and empathy and wonderment that parents have for them. Again, everything above the line is what parents are feeling for non-parents. Everything below the line is what non-parents think they're feeling. So they are thinking they're feeling jealousy and resentment. And while those exist to a small degree, they're not nearly as much as non-parents think they are. The thing is, though, you might have noticed that the numbers on the line for the previous chart were much higher. Turns out that parents' highest emotion for non-parents is appreciation, only 58%. Non-parents think much more highly of parents than the other way around. So the question becomes, why are parents projecting so much negative energy when it's not really there? There's quite a few reasons for it. A big part is because of all the guilt and struggle that parents feel with being torn between two worlds constantly. And the pandemic made those choices so much more frequent and so much more difficult. So one dad who worked in media talked about how he's got daily angst around going to his son's soccer game. He now has the ability to do it because he's working from home. So he's actually around to be able to do it, but he's not sure. Should he tell his team he's cutting out early or not? Should he just check email while he's at the game and pretend like he's still working? Every time he has to deal with this, it's an internal struggle for him nonstop.
Another reason we think parents might be projecting some of these negative feelings all over non-parents that don't actually exist is that parents think they know what it's like to be in the other shoes, right? If you are somebody who doesn't have children, you recognize that you don't know what it's like to have children, where if you have children, there was a time in your life when you didn't, and it's very easy to assume that you know exactly what that experience is like, even though it was probably a long time ago under very different circumstances. And if we're being honest, we're probably romanticizing it a little bit. As one parent said, there's this feeling among parents that they know what it's like to be a non-parent, but non-parents can never really understand what it's like to be a parent. And then especially in the pandemic, it's like parents make all these shortcut associations about what it's been like for non-parents going through the pandemic, because we imagine how we would have handled it if we didn't have kids. But there's no real way to imagine it because we actually never were a person without children in a pandemic. So we think that we would know, even though we actually have no idea.
That said, as we mentioned at the top of this talk, parents in the US do have very little societal, government, structural resources. So just look at how many working mothers had to leave the workforce due to lack of childcare options during the pandemic. So of course there's anger, right? Of course there's negativity. It's just unfortunate that that anger and that negativity is directed at interpersonal relationships versus the system or the government as a whole. Like, we as parents need to take that anger and go to Congress rather than feeling certain ways about our coworkers who don't have children. So how can we even begin to tackle all of this? We asked parents and people without kids for the advice that they would give the other side. We also realized we needed to go to an expert. So we tapped Laura Wallace, who has her master's in social work and is a transition coach, trainer, and facilitator. She gave us some excellent frameworks and thoughts that we'll share in just a minute. And we're especially excited to invite two of our McKinney colleagues, two women who don't have children of their own, Alex Schulhafer, Group Creative Director, and Anita Schillhorn, Director of Strategy. We want them to join the conversation as well to provide a balanced perspective, so you're not just hearing from two moms.
Awesome to have you guys. So one of the things that we saw in the survey that was really striking is there's this feeling, especially if you are not a parent, that parents kind of have a sort of get out of commitments free card that they can basically, as long as they invoke their child, there's no questions asked when they have to leave. And there's a sense that, you know, if you don't have kids, you don't get that same sort of unquestioned kind of acceptance, and that maybe what is going on with you isn't as valid. So I'm curious, Alex, if you could talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trends that were coming out are that parents are constantly seeking for people to please understand them, and that people without kids are please asking not to assume. You know, I think the thing that's coming out here is each side needs both of those things. We need not to overassume, and we need to seek to understand, because everyone needs to feel empowered to do what they need to do for their life and for their well-being. And we need to treat all of those things as equally valid. And I think when we do that, we'll create a better work environment and a better space to get our work done in the best way possible.
But I mean, it's true that there's like, you know, we heard this story about a woman that her old agency joked that they should invent a rent a kid business where they would get Cabbage Patch Kids so that they could be like, Eliza Lynn has a doctor's appointment, I gotta go, and nobody would question it. Like, what do you think? Is that true to you? This idea that it's harder to get the space if you don't have a kid to fall back on?
It can be. But it's also, I think that's where managers and people in leadership can really make big change happen. Because I know from my experience as a manager, just talking to the people on my team and understanding what their situation is, everybody's life is different. The people around them is different. Their living situation is different. I have one creative director on my team who is very much a caregiver for 3 people in her family, but she's not a parent. And I don't think she should have to explain to everybody her needs in time. I can seek to talk to her about that and help her to make that space. But yeah, I think we all just need to be more open-minded to what different life experiences look like, because we're not living in a time where everybody's doing the same cookie cutter thing in life.
That is so true. I mean, I have to confess, there have been times that I've had to do something like had a therapy appointment that got moved to the middle of the day, and I have 100% said it's for my kid, even when it wasn't, because I knew that if I made it about my kid, nobody would question it. And so I don't want to live in a world where I have to use my kid as a shield. And I also don't want to live in a world where other people feel like they have to confess things that they don't want to talk about in order to earn the space to take care of themselves and their lives. So I'm really curious, like, what do we do? How do we actually get from kind of where we are, where parents maybe get a little bit more of a pass than other people? How do we create that space where everybody gets what they need?
I think so much of it is modeling, right? Like, I'm pretty clear if I have a specific thing. I don't have kids. And I'm pretty clear if I have a specific thing that I need to do, that I take that time, and that I'm very clear with, the people that I report into and the people that report into me. This is the time that I'm taking. Sometimes I'll be open with the reason why, and sometimes it is very personal and I'm not able to express that in a work environment, and that's okay. And I think the same for the people that report into me. I want to make sure that they can set their boundaries and tell me what's important to them. Sometimes it's about like, I need this amount of time, or I need to finish my day here because I have to go take care of my kids. And sometimes it's something quite different. Like, I have one person reporting into me who loves to take improv class, and that starts at a certain time. And at that time, I'm like, that's what she's doing. And it's something that's actually really shown up as something that's positive for her and her own well-being and her place in work, right? So I think we all need to recognize, even when we're talking about caregivers, we're also in a position where we have to take care of ourselves, and modeling that is something that's incredibly important.
Yeah, Laura actually talked to us about the concept of non-negotiables and flexibles, and being really clear about those two things. This is my non-negotiable, this is my flexible. But she also reminded us that it's not about letting people off the hook, right? You got to get the work done, or you have to figure out how the work's gonna get done if you have a non-negotiable that prevents you from getting the work done. So the responsibility is still there, but so is the permission to have the conversation about those things that are non-negotiable and those things that are flexible.
I love that. And it doesn't even just give space for non-parents, right? Like, being explicit about what are your flexibles, what are your non-negotiables, that actually creates more space for parents, because sometimes there's this tendency, we heard from parents, for people to assume that they can't take on more instead of actually ask them what they're capable of. There's an amazing podcast called Inclusion in Progress. And a woman who came on the podcast recently said, in reference to a former boss who had sort of decided for her that she wasn't going to be eligible for a promotion because she had young children, it was just going to be too much. And she put it so well when she said, "Who gave you permission to slow down my career?" And that just really, really hit home.
Yeah. There's also that thing of like expecting that people without kids on your team, particularly people who are single, can plan all the social stuff. I know I'm guilty of that. Alex, I'm sorry if I've done that to you.
I think I one time said,
right?
I'll be single forever if you expect me to always be the one that has to lead happy hour.
Exactly right. So the point is, it's not just for like work, it's also the like emotional labor stuff that surrounds work too. And speaking of some of those intangibles, that brings us to a point about talking, right? Kind of found through the course of this project that parents, well, we talk a lot about what it is to be parents. We talk a lot about our kids. We don't realize it. It's a default topic, and we just go to it so easily. And so I've been kind of had my eyes opened to how much, we chatter about our kids, but I'm curious, like, Anita, Alex, is that something you've noticed? And, how can we kind of address it in like big ways and small ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple of things there in what you're saying. I think one of them is, even in spaces like this where we're coming together talking about the role of women in work, that are where the issue of parenthood is intrinsic to what we're trying to accomplish, right? We talked about childcare, parental leave. These issues are so important to women as a whole and our advancement as a whole. But sometimes that idea of womanhood and motherhood becomes conflated, and it becomes kind of one whole topic. And the issues that affect women without children just kind of disappear within that conversation. And even when we were doing this survey, one of the things that I noticed is many parents saying to non-parents something along the lines of like, when you become a mom, you'll understand, you'll get it in the future. And that's a little bit patronizing, to be honest. There's a lot of women who can't have children, who don't want to have children. And the assumption that it's every woman's destiny to become a mother can make people who aren't in that boat feel really isolated. And for some women, it can be a pretty painful topic. There's a lot of infertility, there's health issues. There's a lot of things that make, parenthood be an impossible goal for some women. And that's really hard to talk about in a work environment. And at the same time, there's women who don't want to have children who have made this choice, and they are asked to defend that choice very much within the context of our culture that expects women to kind of go into this role of motherhood, even still. So, making sure that we understand where all women are coming from and recognizing that we're not just seeing women through the lens of motherhood or potential motherhood, but recognizing that women have all kinds of experiences and relationships to that role.
Great advice. I know one of the things I noticed a lot during the course of this project was the start of every meeting. We spend a lot of time waiting for, it's really one person, but waiting for people to show up, right? And so then we engage in small talk. And what is that small talk always about? Kids.
Our kids, guilty.
Like weird default. I don't know why. They're just an easy topic. And, as we were doing this project, I had this funny experience of interviewing two people back to back. One was a dad who said, everybody loves the exploits of my kids and everybody on my team wants to hear it. They don't have kids, so they love hearing it. Right, Alex, Anita, you love hearing it. Then right after that, I spoke with someone who didn't have a kid who said, we had this internal review and it started with 5 minutes of baby poop advice. I've had nothing. And I started to realize I had no idea that all that chatter about kids that I thought people found charming, and maybe sometimes you guys find it charming, maybe sometimes you feel excluded though. And so that was sort of eye-opening for me, that that's one very specific, very small, but very meaningful way that I can show up differently for my team, is to talk about some other things. So thought we'd share a little gift to everyone in the audience here in case you're looking for small talk topics that don't have anything to do with small people. You can talk about a show you're binging, the latest TikTok trend, a grocery store discovery, a trip you want to take, politics and religion. That's safe, right? No, kidding. We're kidding about that last one. The other 9 are safe. There's a lot of things you can talk about that are not about kids. Not to say don't ever talk about your kids. Of course, they're an important part of your life. And sometimes their antics are funny and charming, right? And you do want to share that with your coworkers, but not always.
Yeah. So the biggest takeaway that we got from this, that I got from this, is that this is just the beginning of a bigger conversation. I mean, we haven't even really gotten into what happens when you start separating it out. Men with kids, men without kids, women with kids, women without kids. That's when, stay tuned. But really the biggest takeaway.
Seniority was another big one, right?
Yeah, there's so many.
Mm-hmm, yep.
This is going to be an ongoing conversation. Y'all will be hearing from us again, so get ready. But really, the biggest takeaway for us, and one parent put it really, really perfectly, and it's this idea that we should all have the right and the ability to create boundaries between our personal life and our work. Parents are in a situation where they're forced to do that because you can't not help another human being thrive and survive. But imagine how amazing it would be for all of us if all of us had that right. And I don't know about all of you, but that's the kind of culture and the kind of agency and the kind of industry that I want to work in.
Ditto. Thanks so much, Jenny, Alex, and Anita. Hope everybody enjoyed this talk.